Some practices are well known in the church, such as worship or prayer. Others are not so well known. I would argue that lament is an example of a Christian practice that is not so well known, but that still fits our definition of being something that's been a part of the Christian tradition from all time. I mean, it's built on the Psalms of Lament. So long as we have had the Psalms, we have had lament as part of our tradition. I believe that lament offers a particularly helpful possibility for using practices to help the people entrusted to our care. Lament is crying out to God and saying, this is not how you promised things would be. It's a response to pain, to loss, to suffering, to injustice. And if we have said that part of what we want to do is to respond to the longings and losses of the people entrusted to our care, if we have gone through empathetic listening to listen to our people, to hear their instability, to hear their loss, then we need to be able to find a way to respond to that pain, to that suffering, to that loss. The appropriate biblical response to loss is lament. If you are living in a community of faith where you have people that encounter pain, suffering, injustice, if you have people who encounter the human condition, what it means to be human, and why life is hard, then you need to teach your people lament in order to be able to give them an appropriate response to that. The appropriate biblical response to loss is lament. Think about some examples. Jesus on the cross. When Jesus is hanging on the cross, he cries out using the words of Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? He's not asking a rhetorical question. He's invoking the psalm and all the pieces of what the psalm has to say. The Psalms provide a language that allow us to cry out to God, to cry out about the injustice to God, and still remain faithful and trusting to God. The message of the Psalms of Lament is that God can handle your honesty, even and especially when you are angry at God. And even when other people can't handle that honesty or pain or that anger. Think about how many of the people that are entrusted to our care regularly hear from their parents, from their loved ones, from others, from the church itself, you have no place here with your pain. Don't bring your pain to us. You should always be positive. We're tired of dealing with your pain. There's no good way to talk about your pain. You should just shut up and allow us to worship God in pleasant joy. We have this idea that somehow joy and lament don't go together. But in fact, look at the Psalms. The Psalms purposefully place joy and lament together. The Psalms of Lament legitimate the words that others might see as disrespectful. They might say, how can you talk to God that way? God's an authority figure. God deserves respect. The Psalms of Lament give us the words that automatically say it is appropriate to talk to God this way because it is Scripture. We are emulating, we are copying what is in Scripture, and that is what God invites us to do. The other thing is that the Psalms of Lament follow a structure. The structure is important because it allows us to remain faithful. We start with an opening address, and then we have a complaint to God. But immediately following that complaint is some kind of statement of trust. It's not just whining. It is saying to God, I trust you enough that I can be completely honest with you. There's a petition for help, and then there's a vow of praise. We can use these pieces in order to be able to construct for our people a way to talk to God even in the midst of their pain. What would be some examples? How might we make use of lament? Let me give you two examples. There was a church in Colorado that we worked with where they heard about this idea of lament, and they decided to create a wailing wall in their church. They took styrofoam blocks and they built it up and they painted it so that it looked like a little wailing wall. And they gave their people, in this case, high school students and middle school, they gave them little slips of paper. And they told them they could write whatever they wanted on those papers. And they could roll them up and stick them in the wailing wall. And that there would be Christians who would take those and they would pray for them no matter what they said. Some of them just simply stated pain. Some of them cried out in anger towards God. But they knew that they could be honest. And what happened? Others in the congregation eventually heard about this, and eventually they cried out for having the same kind of thing, and they ended up making this kind of wailing wall something that was a part of a service that included young people, adults, senior adults, the whole congregation. They saw this idea of lament as applying to everyone in the church. That's example number one. Example number two was a church in Orlando. What they decided to do is they decided that they were working especially with middle schoolers, and they said, middle school is hard. There's an awful lot of pain and difficulty, loss that is a part of being in middle school. So we're going to teach lament to middle schoolers. But they couldn't just immediately get middle schoolers to talk about their own pain. So they started them by praying about far-off issues, a flood in Bangladesh, or some kind of someone who was suffering that they don't know. And then eventually they brought it closer, and then they taught them to talk about pain that they might see in their community, or even maybe some loved ones. And then in the end, they ended up writing their own laments. They used that structure that we just talked about to be able to say exactly what they needed to say to God. Well, others in the congregation found out about it, adults, elderly folks, and they wanted to be able to do the same thing. And the idea of lament spread to others in the congregation. How might we make use of lament? We might make use by building a wailing wall. We might be able to teach lament to middle schoolers. We might be able to teach lament to people who are in their first jobs as they are out of college. We might create a lament over student debt. There's lots of things that we can do, but the point is that we want to get our people so that they can talk honestly to God, because the appropriate biblical response to loss is lament.